For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Sashni Wali. Investigative journalist Adrian Besson joins me today to discuss his co-authored book, Enemy of the People: How Jacob Zuma Stole South Africa and How the People Fought Back. Now, in the wake of Jacob's book, South Africans seem more eager to read about state capture and corruption. What can the public expect from your book, given that there are many of the same topic being published recently?
Look, I think what Peter and I try to do is, we are working journalists every day, and we sit in our newsrooms and we pump out these breaking news stories. South Africa has no shortage of breaking news. What we tried to do with the book was to take a bit of a step back and do a more deep dive, do an analytical and big picture view of the Zuma era and tell the story of how we ended up with this state capture that's really entrenched in government. This didn't start in the past year or two. It started in 2007 at Polokwane when Jacob Zuma won the ANC election, and we tried to do a chronology of that period, of the decade of Zuma first capturing the ANC, then moving on to state institutions, putting bad and compromised people to lead state institutions, and finally opening up the spaces for his son Duduzane and the Gupta family to capture the state.
You write that Zuma has survived through a combination of strategic foresights and structural weaknesses in the ANC. What are examples of some of these?
Look, I think Zuma is obviously understands and knows the ANC inside out. He has got dirt on a lot of people in the ANC, and we also have the famous quote from Batabile Dlamini in this beginning of our book where she said, "We're all of our small Nyana skeletons," and that shouldn't come out. So Jacob Zuma, because of his former role as intelligence chief of the ANC, knows the ANC very well. Strategically appoints people into positions, doesn't keep them for a long time. For example, one of the arguments we make in the book is that he never wanted someone for a long time in the police, the intelligence agency, or the NPA who can become so strong and can ultimately make sure that the right people are prosecuted. He wanted to keep control of prosecution of the people who are investigated. That's why we had this massive turnover of police chiefs, criminal intelligence chiefs, and NPA bosses. We also look at the fact that he used the ANC's strategic weaknesses to his advantage. The difference between the Tuliaus and government, the fact that the Tuliaus later on had no more control over him, that he could fire and hire ministers, fire Pravin Gordhan without even informing the top six of the ANC, because he had this absolute stronghold over the ANC. So I think that's some of the examples we give in the book.
You write that Mbeki chose Zuma as his deputy, believing that he didn't have the ambition to succeed him. So how then did Zuma build such a large support base, and why did people rally around him so fiercely?
Look, President Zuma is very different from former President Mbeki. He's a very jovial man, he's very charming. We in the book give a number of examples where even people like former DA leader Helen Zille said how absolutely charming, almost disarmingly charming Zuma was during her engagements with him. He's a people's person. He relates very friendly with people, and I think that makes him very different from Mbeki, who was seen as cold, who was seen as inaccessible, who in fact didn't end up meeting with people like the SA Communist Party and the trade leaders at the end of his term. And that's why these people went for Zuma. That's why people like Zwelinzima Vavi, Julius Malema and Blyton Zimande backed Zuma to beat Mbeki. It had less to do with who Zuma is and what he brings to the table, but more about their hatred for Mbeki. And I think that that kind of that golden thread came throughout his term, that he didn't really bring anything strategic to the table. Jacob Zuma didn't bring a very firm economic policy, he didn't bring any particularly new ideas about governance, about how to stop corruption. In fact, we argue he used the time in office to enrich himself and his family and to make sure the criminal justice system doesn't prosecute him.
You illustrate in your book how Zwelinzima Vavi and Julius Malema became disillusioned with Zuma. Briefly tell us how this happened.
So Zwelinzima Vavi was at the time the leader of COSATU. Julius Malema was the leader of the ANC Youth League when they got Zuma into power. And as I explained, obviously they wanted Zuma to beat Mbeki. After Zuma has gotten into power, he didn't give them what they wanted. Malema and the ANC Youth League from the start was very much sure they wanted more radical economic transformation. In fact, they used those words, which the Guptas and the Zuma Brigade now claims as their own. Zwelinzima Vavi obviously wanted a better dispensation for workers. And it didn't happen under President Zuma. And I think it took them 2 to 3 years to see that. They also saw the enrichment of his family. Very early in his term, Duduzane Zuma were already in bed with the Gupta family in terms of business transactions. You remember the ICT deal, the failed maneuver to take over the BE partnership of ArcelorMittal, for example. And these are some of the things that happened very crudely. And I think someone like Vavi and Malema quickly saw what they were dealing with here, and that led to the split ultimately between them and President Zuma. Vavi went on to coin the phrase a predator state, that we are turning into a predator state. Malema, in fact, as ANC Youth League leader, was the first person to talk of a government of families. And then the ANC itself was outraged after the Waterkloof landing of the Gupta private jet at Waterkloof Air Force Base for a private wedding. Gwedi Mantashe issued a very strong worded statement that day, but ultimately they couldn't get Zuma out of the position and get him to stop doing these things.
You write that Jacob Zuma became the ANC and the ANC became Jacob Zuma. How did this happen?
I think it happened. It started in Polokwane when the entire ANC changed. I mean, this issue of slates, really became a big issue in the ANC in 2007, when the entire Mbeki faction of the ANC was outvoted. People like Terry Lekota, Pumzile Mlambo Nguka, Toko Diza even at the time, people who were part of Mbeki's circle were kicked out of the ANC. So it was a different ANC that emerged after Polokwane in 2007. A lot of rogues inside the top NEC, people like Tony Yengeni making a comeback, people with criminal records, people who's got their own financial problems, own run-ins with the law. They were on this Zuma bandwagon. And I think Zuma cleverly knew this. He knows the weaknesses, he knows the dirt, he knows where the proverbial skeletons are buried. And he used this to his advantage in the appointment of people, for example, compromise individuals. And then in the process, he also made some faulty appointments of people who were really independent, people like Mpulisini Kasana at the NPA, who really came from KZN, wasn't a very well-known lawyer, but showed his steel, showed his mettle at the NPA and wouldn't be manipulated. He had to be moved out. Anwar Ramat the same at the Hawks. He had to be moved out. So Zuma made some tactical errors in the process of people he thought he could trust, who wouldn't go after him and his family, but ultimately he got what he wanted.
It seemed odd to many that Cyril Ramaphosa agreed to be Jacob Zuma's deputy when he took over the presidency. So why did Ramaphosa agree to return to politics in this role?
It remains a mystery, and Ramaphosa himself has never completely clarified why he agreed to be Zuma's deputy. What we know is, at the time, you'll remember the Nkandla scandal had just broken in 2012, and there was a massive revolt against the Zuma ANC by the middle class, especially the ANC middle class voters in Gauteng and other provinces. And the ANC really had a risk of losing the middle class as a voting bloc. So they needed someone to bring them back. Zuma was very much seen as a tribal man. He had made all kinds of quotes in Parliament about so-called clever blacks. That black people who are educated can somehow no longer exercise discipline and speak out against elders, etc. And Cyril Ramaphosa was brought in by the Zuma camp, I think, to stop the outflow of the middle class, to try and show them that they still have a kind of a city man, a big businessman, is still welcome in the ANC. Politically, obviously, I think that Ramaphosa always wanted to be the ANC president. He obviously lost it to Thabo Mbeki when former President Nelson Mandela wanted Ramaphosa to actually succeed him, but the ANC overruled Mandela. So I think there was also a part of that. Ramaphosa saw this as ultimately something he couldn't buy with money. This was the one thing he couldn't buy and that he still wanted. And that's why he's campaigning so hard to actually win in December.
Tell us about how the Guptas came onto the scene. They were relatively unknown, but had been making political gains as early as 1998.
Look, Atul Gupta actually came to South Africa in 1993 already, the year before democracy. And he started a very successful small business, selling clothes and other things from his boot at Bruma Lake in Johannesburg. And then started building Sara Computers, this company that started out small, assembling computers with parts that they imported. And we actually write in the book that in another lifetime, books would have been written about the business success of Atul Gupta, who managed to build a very strong computer empire out of nothing. The big change came when Ajay Gupta, the older brother, and Tony Gupta, the younger brother, came to South Africa in the early 2000s, and they really kind of brought the whole family here and started infiltrating the ANC, started making friends in high places, started with Esop Pahat, the former minister in the presidency, in the in the Mbeki presidency, and tried to make their way into the ANC through Mbeki, couldn't, and then really started focusing on Jacob Zuma and his family. I think the Guptas played it very cleverly. They have their tentacles all over the state, not only at the level of minister and president, but also in the civil servants. We've seen with the Gupta leaks that has come out this year that there were lots of emails going to civil servants in SOEs, in state departments, really controlling the appointment of people at kind of mid-management, senior management level in government. And that's just extraordinary how they built their influence inside the state and using their access to President Zuma. And I think we would argue that if they didn't have Jacob Zuma on their books, if they didn't have his family as part of, his son as almost part of their family, this wouldn't have happened.
Explain to us how Glencore was strong-armed into selling optimum to the Guptas.
Look, the story of how a mine was hijacked is extraordinary. I mean, here you had Glencore being throttled by Eskom to sell coal at a certain price. A price that they agreed years before that Eskom just couldn't maintain, which one can understand. But instead of putting the transaction on the market, looking for the highest bidder, here goes Minister Mosebenzi Zwane, who the Guptas had a very strong hand in appointing to the position, flies to Geneva, meets the boss of Glencore with the Guptas, and convinces him to sell his mine to the Guptas. How extraordinary. What kind of access is that? No other business person in South Africa has that kind of access to a minister. Mosebenzi Zwane then goes from Geneva, flies back to Dubai with the Guptas on their private jet, probably to celebrate with expensive champagne, who knows. But that story just told us the level of influence they had in government, and the level, the fact that they could have a government minister going with them to negotiate this transaction. Obviously, they took over Optimum coal mine, and they had to pay an expensive penalty, which was brought down by Eskom. Eskom made new deals with the Guptas. We've now seen the extent of the link between the Guptas and Eskom, and I'm sure there's still a lot of these stories to unfold. But that was really one example that showed the extraordinary influence they had over government ministers.
The story of Mcebisi Jonas refusing a treasury job is well known. But how did Des van Rooyen get onto the Gupta's radar after Jonas refused the job?
The story about Des van Rooyen is interesting because he wasn't really a well-known politician, and it's still a bit of a mystery how he came to be their candidate for finance minister. We know that he was in parliament, that he was part of the economics or the finance portfolio committee. He's got a history of politics in the northwest and Gauteng, in the west rand of Gauteng. One can assume that the Northwest Province maybe had something to do with that, a very close part of the Premier League that supports President Zuma and his allies. But yes, it remains a mystery of exactly how Des van Rooyen came to be the finance minister, for a weekend. We know that he was placed at Treasury with his advisors who were given to him, people who were linked to the Guptas, and it was clear what the plan was to really capture Treasury.
Tell us about the high-level crisis meeting that took place between banking and the ANC following Van Rooyen's appointment.
So we reveal in the book the details of that meeting, very interesting details, who attended, from which banks, the type of individuals involved. And this was really a pivotal moment, the moment that in history will be known as 9/12, when Jacob Zuma abruptly fired Nhlanhla Nene as the Minister of Finance. The market took a huge dip. We lost billions of rands on one day. And people like Cyril Ramaphosa and Zweli Mkhize from the ANC side stood up against Zuma and said, no, we cannot have this. The private sector came into a meeting with Jeff Radebe, the Minister of Policy in the presidency. People like Maria Ramos was there, people like Colin Coleman from Goldman Sachs was there. And they really made compelling arguments to Jeff Radebe to say, look, if the markets open in China tomorrow morning, this is what will happen to your economy. And things could have gone that way. We could have been in a much worse situation now had Des van Rooyen stayed on as finance minister and he wasn't replaced by Pravin Gordhan. So really a fascinating story, fascinating insights into that moment.
You mentioned the likes of various foundations in South Africa. What makes the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation different?
I think the large part of the book we dedicate to the fight back of South Africans, because we really believe that, you know, South Africans have shown, specifically over the last 5 years, that they won't just sit back and allow Zuma to destroy this country. And we've seen the uprising of a number of civil society organizations like Corruption Watch, like Freedom Under Law, like ALTA, like the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, Helen Suzman Foundation. I think what made the Kathrada Foundation so special was during that time, just after Pravin Gordhan was fired or recalled from London on his Treasury roadshow, Kathrada passed away. And his memorial services almost became a rallying point for this moment, for people who said no to state capture and for Zuma's destruction of South Africa. And you'll remember the memorial service where I think it was former President Kgalema Motlanthe actually asked Pravin Gordhan to stand up, you know, and people applauded him. I think this was a pivotal moment. The Kathrada memorial services became platforms for people like Pravin Gordhan to speak out. It's extraordinary in the fact that the former finance minister is now speaking freely about state capture, about what went on in institutions like SARS, and how that should have been prevented. So I think, you know, that's why the Kathrada Foundation really played a big role.
Tell us of the birth of the term white monopoly capital.
So look, in the book we take a deep dive into the beginning of the WMC campaign, the trips that the designer Zuma and others made to see Bell Pottinger, the PR firm who advised them on this campaign about radical economic transformation, you know, and just how this came to be, the extraordinary fact that here the President Zuma's son could sit here and make an argument to these British spin doctors that there's no economic transformation in South Africa, while his father has been in position for at least 20 years to influence economic policy in South Africa and has not done anything tangible to show that. WMC was a very high level concept constructed by Bell Pottinger with the help of the Guptas and specifically the designer Zuma, who came out and said, look, this is obviously the way to change the narrative. This was the counter narrative for state capture, let's be honest. And they used Twitter bots, they used people on Twitter, social media to attack us. They called it fake news, any kind of reports on state capture. And there was a whole sophisticated strategy that has now led to the downfall of Bell Pottinger. So again, I think the good people won.
What are your predictions for the ANC's elective conference in December?
I think it's a very close race. Ultimately, it's a race against President Zuma's candidate, who is his ex-wife, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. That much is very much clear. It's also clear that the Guptas are behind Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. She herself has been a very weak candidate. She sings from the same hymn sheet as the Guptas and her former husband. On the other side, you have Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa, who's trying to portray himself as the candidate who's anti-state capture, who will clean up the ANC and the state. And then you have William Keys in the middle, who's trying to be the unifier candidate between these two frontrunners. At this stage, I think it's very close. I think a lot's going to depend on horse trading at conference. And I do think there's going to have to be concessions by both camps. I don't think it will just be one slate or the other. I will find it extraordinarily shocking if someone like Cyril Ramaphosa does not make it in the end. And if there's not some kind of role for Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma in the top 6, which would lead to a split in the ANC, I think.
That was Adrian Basson discussing his co-authored book, Enemy of the People.